Letter to Martha Washington, from George Washington, June 18th, 1775. My dearest, I am now set down to write you on a subject which fills me with inexpressible concern. It has been determined in Congress that the whole army raised for the defense of the American cause shall be put under my care. You may believe me when I assure you that far from seeking this appointment, I have used every endeavor in my power to avoid it. But, as it has been a kind of destiny that has thrown me upon this service, I shall hope that my undertaking of it is designed to answer some good purpose. For nearly a year, the British Army had occupied Boston. From the surrounding hills, General George Washington and his inexperienced Continental Army maintained a fragile position. While the Americans possessed determination, they lacked the one thing necessary to drive the British from the city: heavy artillery. Without cannon, there would be no hope of liberating Boston. And so General Washington turned to an unlikely hero, a 25-year-old Boston bookseller named Henry Knox. Months earlier, American forces had captured Fort Ticonderoga, seizing dozens of British cannons. Knox proposed retrieving them and transporting them nearly 300 miles through the New England wilderness in the dead of winter. Using ox-drawn sleds, Knox assembled what he called a noble train of artillery. The expedition crossed frozen lakes, snow-covered mountains, and icy rivers. Knox was determined that not one of these guns be lost, leading to daring retrievals when some cannons crashed through the ice of the Hudson River. Against overwhelming odds, all 59 pieces of artillery, weighing nearly 60 tons, arrived outside Boston. Washington had his guns. Now he needed an opportunity. Under cover of darkness, thousands of American soldiers quietly advanced onto Dorchester Heights, the commanding hills overlooking Boston Harbor. Bringing cannons and hauling timber, they spent the night digging trenches, erecting breastworks, and positioning their artillery. There was no time to waste, as the operation had to be completed in the cover of darkness before dawn. If discovered too soon, the British could attack before the defenses were ready. As the sun rose over Boston Harbor on March 5th, British officers awoke to an astonishing sight. The once empty heights had been transformed into a fortified stronghold bristling with American artillery aimed directly at the city and the British fleet below. British General William Howe exclaimed, "These fellows have done more work in one night than I could make my army do in 3 months." This most astonishing night's work seemed so impossible that one would assume it had been aided by a supernatural force. The expedition to and fortification of Dorchester Heights, one British observer noted, is equal to that of the genie belonging to Aladdin's wonderful lamp. General Howe immediately understood the danger such a fortification presented. If Washington retained control of Dorchester Heights, British forces could no longer safely remain in Boston. The heights had to be retaken, and so British troops began embarking for the attack. Veterans who had fought at Bunker Hill prepared once again to advance against fortified Americans on elevated ground. Washington, aware that an assault was imminent, strengthened the defenses atop Dorchester Heights. The two sides stood on the threshold of another devastating battle. Then, on the very night the attack was to begin, snow and sleet battered the city. Fierce winds churned the waters beneath the British transports. The enemy assault that had seemed inevitable was now suddenly impossible. Dr. James Thatcher of the Continental Army recorded, "I have not, in the course of my recollection, experienced a more violent storm. Thus has a kind Providence seen fit to frustrate a design which must have been attended with immense slaughter and bloodshed." By the time the storm had passed, Washington's defenses had grown even stronger. Howe now faced a terrible choice: continue on in the plan to launch a costly assault reminiscent of Bunker Hill, or abandon Boston altogether. He chose withdrawal. And so on March 17, 1776, more than 11,000 British soldiers, sailors, and Loyalist civilians departed Boston Harbor bound for Halifax. Without a major battle and the bloodshed it would bring, Boston was free. Washington entered the city in triumph. The Revolution had survived its first great test. The 4th of July, 1776, would become a date solidified in world history and remembered by generations to come. But what is often forgotten is that on the 5th of July, 1775, the Continental Congress had adopted the Olive Branch Petition, a document that lacked the boldness and brilliance of the Declaration that would be adopted just 1 year later. This humble petition, as Congress called it, did not lay a long train of abuses at the king's feet. Instead, it read, "With all devotion that principle and affection can inspire, connected with Great Britain by the strongest ties that can unite societies, and deploring every event that tends in any degree to weaken them, we solemnly assure your Majesty that we most ardently desire that the former harmony between her and these colonies be restored." Differing from one another in religion, economy, geography, and culture, the idea that these 13 separate colonies might one day speak with a single voice, and that voice would call for complete separation from their mother country, would not only have seemed highly improbable, but also deeply undesirable. For many Americans, independence promised not liberty, but uncertainty. It meant severing ties with the most powerful empire on earth, risking economic collapse, inviting military devastation, and exchanging the familiar protections of British citizenship for an experiment in self-government whose outcome no one could predict. Indeed, when the topic of independence was brought up, many who sat with John Dickinson in Congress, as well as many of the colonists they represented, agreed with his words. "Our means of defense are so precarious, and our strength so weak, that if we fail, destruction must overwhelm us and our posterity. We are launching into a sea of troubles in a paper skiff." So what was it that changed the minds and hearts of the colonists? What made them defy their king less than a year after sending a petition requesting reconciliation with him? It was due in part to the words of an immigrant who had only lived in America for 1 year. Neither soldier nor statesman, Thomas Paine was a writer whose widely read pamphlet, Common Sense, challenged Americans to confront a reality many had long resisted. Reconciliation was no longer possible. "There is something absurd," he wrote, "in supposing a continent can be perpetually governed by an island. The period of debate is closed. Arms as the last resource decide the contest." And indeed, arms already were deciding the contest. Even before the Olive Branch Petition had reached London, King George III had issued his answer. In a proclamation, he declared that the colonies had proceeded to an open and avowed rebellion, and called upon his officers to exert their utmost endeavors to suppress such rebellion and to bring the traitors to justice. The relationship many Americans had desperately sought to preserve was already unraveling. Meanwhile, the war itself continued to reshape public opinion. General Washington forcing the British evacuation of Boston demonstrated that a united army and people might be able to attain independence after all. One by one, colonial assemblies reconsidered their positions. Instructions to delegates were revised. Men who had once urged caution began now to contemplate separation. But the delegates of the Continental Congress understood the stakes too. Should they fail, they would be remembered not as founders, but as traitors. Benjamin Franklin knew the importance of unity in the face of such danger, as he rightly observed, "We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." But the debates that followed were intense. Behind closed doors, a war of words unfolded that matched the heat of the Philadelphia summer. Eventually, and miraculously, as John Adams later remembered, 13 clocks were made to strike together, a perfection of mechanism which no artist had ever before effected. Independence had been declared, and with it, a beautiful articulation of human rights was put on paper. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This Declaration of Independence was adopted on July 4th, 1776. Because it was a leap year, it marked exactly 365 days since the adoption of the Olive Branch Petition, a remarkably short amount of time for a remarkably dramatic turn of events. Thomas Jefferson's words at the end of the Declaration captured the complete commitment these once fiercely divided men now had for their cause and for one another. "With a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." It was a promise to risk everything, and within weeks, that promise would be tested. Following the British evacuation of Boston, General William Howe assembled one of the largest forces Great Britain had ever sent across the Atlantic. More than 30,000 British and Hessian troops gathered in and around New York Harbor. Witnessing the growing fleet, George Washington confessed in a letter, "I never before had so lively an idea of the power of Great Britain as I have by witnessing this fleet." Another American soldier remarked, "I thought all London was afloat." And then there was the Continental Army, poorly trained, poorly equipped, and clearly vastly outnumbered. New York, with its deep water harbor, made it strategically invaluable to both sides. John Adams described New York as a kind of key to the whole continent, for which no effort to secure it ought to be omitted. And so Washington fortified Brooklyn Heights and the principal roads leading inland from Long Island. There he anticipated the British would launch a direct assault. Instead, General Howe devised a different plan. Thousands of British and Hessian troops marched along an unguarded route known as the Jamaica Pass. Guided by Loyalist sympathizers, they slipped around the American left flank. At dawn, the trap was sprung. Continental soldiers who had prepared to face an enemy in front of them suddenly found British troops appearing at their rear. Chaos ensued. Across Long Island, American units fought desperate delaying actions in an effort to prevent complete disaster. Among them were the troops later remembered as the Maryland 400, who repeatedly charged overwhelming British forces to buy precious time for their fellow soldiers to escape. Washington surveyed the scene and exclaimed, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." By day's end, more than 300 Americans had been killed, and more than 1,000 others had been captured. It was one of the most crushing defeats of Washington's military career. The remnants of the Continental Army withdrew behind the fortifications at Brooklyn Heights, but those who had survived the battle now found themselves trapped. The Americans were pinned against the East River as General Howe and his troops patiently laid the groundwork for an attack. Once British artillery had been brought forward and the Royal Navy had closed the East River, Washington's surrender would be all but certain. The cause of American independence, proclaimed only weeks before, was already on the verge of annihilation. British troops stood poised to deliver the death blow. It was then, during the night, that Washington made a daring decision. In the darkness, the entire army would attempt to cross the East River and escape to Manhattan. The task was staggering. Nearly 9,000 soldiers, along with horses, artillery, ammunition, and supplies, would have to be transported across the water using a small collection of boats. Hour after hour, Colonel John Glover's Marblehead mariners rowed silently across the river, ferrying the soldiers and supplies to safety. But the work was exhausting and required the cloak of darkness to be successful. Dawn was now approaching, and still thousands of men remained on the Brooklyn shore. Benjamin Talmadge, a young officer in the Continental Army, recalled, "As the dawn of the next day approached, those of us who remained in the trenches became very anxious for our own safety." Their anxiety was well-founded. If the British discovered the evacuation before it had been completed, they could unleash artillery fire upon the crowded shoreline and advance against the Americans before they had a chance to escape. The morning sun could bring devastating casualties and consequences to the Continental Army. And then, as it had on that fateful night on Dorchester Heights, the weather changed. Talmadge recalled, "At this time a dense fog began to rise, and it seemed to settle in a peculiar manner over both encampments. So very dense was the atmosphere that I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance. I recollect this peculiar providential occurrence perfectly well. The sun had risen, but the fog remained as dense as ever." Nature itself seemed to be concealing the escaping Continental Army from the view of a well-established, superior enemy. Washington, who later called this retreat little less than miraculous, refused to enter a boat until every soldier under his command had crossed the river safely. As the fog finally began to lift, British soldiers advanced toward the American lines, expecting surrender or battle. Instead, they found abandoned fortifications. The army they had trapped had somehow, right under their noses, vanished by the dawn's early light. As remarkable as the escape from Brooklyn Heights had been, the war could not be won by retreating from the enemy. By December 1776, American setbacks had mounted rapidly. Fort Washington had fallen, resulting in the capture of nearly 3,000 American soldiers. Days later, Fort Lee was abandoned, along with much-needed supplies and equipment. Even the Continental Congress had fled Philadelphia, in fear that the city might soon fall to the British. But the enemy was not the only force threatening the American cause. Time itself had now become an adversary. As the calendar year drew to a close, so too did the enlistments of many of the American soldiers. The army that had once numbered in the tens of thousands was shrinking before Washington's eyes. The commander-in-chief felt the weight of it all. In confidence, I tell you that I never was in such an unhappy, divided state since I was born. No man, I believe, ever had a greater choice of difficulties and less means to extricate himself from them. General Nathaniel Greene echoed those same feelings. Our difficulties were inconceivable to those who were not eyewitnesses to them. The difficulties were indeed severe. Many of the soldiers who remained lacked adequate clothing for the winter campaign. Blankets were scarce, shoes had worn through. Months of military retreats and defeats had taken a heavy toll on morale. Perhaps most painful of all, Washington discovered that even those he trusted were starting to question whether he was the right man to lead the way. It seemed as though the fire of the Revolution was now reduced to its last glowing embers. It was during this time that Thomas Paine once again picked up the pen. In his pamphlet, The American Crisis, he wrote, "These are the times that try men's souls. 'Tis the business of little minds to shrink, but he whose heart is firm, and whose conscience approves his conduct, will pursue his principles unto death. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated." Washington and his men were already paying that proper price. They had endured defeat, cold, hunger, and uncertainty. They desperately needed a victory to reignite the fading fire of the Revolution. And so Washington devised a surprise attack on the most unexpected date of the year, Christmas night. The target was a garrison of Hessian troops in Trenton, New Jersey. The plan called for 3 separate American forces to cross the icy Delaware River during the night. Together, they would converge upon Trenton before dawn. But although the weather had aided the Continental Army in the past, it now presented an immense challenge to their plans. A punishing mixture of sleet, hail, wind, and snow delayed the crossing by several hours. Men who lacked adequate clothing for the intense cold suffered severe frostbite. 2 soldiers even froze to death along the way. Then came the worst news. Due to the relentless winter weather, 2 of the 3 American forces had failed to cross the Delaware. The original plan for a 3-pronged attack on Trenton had collapsed. Only Washington's force had made it to the New Jersey shore. Washington now faced a gut-wrenching decision. Continue the 9-mile march toward Trenton with only a fraction of the military strength he had planned for, risking failure and heavy casualties, or abandon the mission altogether and usher in the new year with another devastating blow to American morale. These are the times that try men's souls. The victories at Trenton and Princeton had breathed new life into the American cause, but independence was far from guaranteed, as the war would continue for nearly 5 more years. There would be victories. At Saratoga, an entire British army surrendered, convincing France to formally join the conflict as an ally, an indispensable partnership long sought by the Americans. There would be sacrifice. At Valley Forge, the Continental Army endured one of the harshest winters of the war and emerged more disciplined through months of rigorous training. There would be setbacks. Charleston fell to the British. Camden ended in disaster. Across the South, the fighting became increasingly brutal. Again and again, the Revolution seemed to teeter between survival and collapse. General Greene's words to George Washington reflected the spirit of the American army itself. We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again. But the Americans would need to do more than simply endure and exhaust British strength. They ultimately needed a victory that would finally secure the blessings of liberty for themselves and their posterity. By 1781, the British still occupied New York City, while the Continental Army remained chronically short of money and supplies, with many of its soldiers going months, even years, without adequate pay. Americans who had endured 6 long years of war had reason to wonder whether independence would ever truly become a reality. And then, an opportunity emerged. Throughout the war, British armies had rarely faced the prospect of destruction. Whenever circumstances turned against them, the Royal Navy ultimately offered an escape. But British General Charles Cornwallis's fortified position at Yorktown, Virginia, could be different. For the first time in the war, Washington had the opportunity not merely to defeat a British army, but to surround, isolate, and compel its surrender. But in order for that to happen, a series of events would have to unfold within a specific time frame. Washington and the French commander Rochambeau would have to secretly march nearly 450 miles south from New York without the British discovering their true destination. The Marquis de Lafayette and his small American force would have to keep constant watch over Cornwallis, preventing him from slipping away before the trap was complete. And, most important of all, at sea, everything depended upon the timely arrival of the French fleet. Sailing from the Caribbean, French Admiral de Grasse would have only a brief window to operate before obligations elsewhere required his departure. For Washington and the fate of the American cause, it was crucial that the French fleet arrive in time to keep the Royal Navy out of the Chesapeake. Otherwise, Cornwallis's army could be reinforced or escape by sea. Whatever efforts are made by the land armies, Washington wrote, the Navy must have the casting vote in the present contest. But achieving that outcome would require an extraordinary convergence of events that no single commander could orchestrate, especially in an age when communication traveled no faster than horse or sail. This battle could become the final word in the Revolutionary War, or could lead to an entirely new chapter. To trap the British once and for all, every piece of the plan would have to fall into place. Lafayette and his soldiers watched Cornwallis closely at Yorktown, preventing his escape, while Washington hurried south with reinforcements. It was during his march toward Yorktown that Washington received a long-awaited message. While normally known for his perfect composure, it is said that General Washington, when he received the news, acted like a child whose every wish had been granted. The French fleet had arrived. Against all odds, the greatest military power on earth had been defeated. The long struggle for American independence was over. A free country had taken its place among the nations of the earth.